Hello, my name is Joe Weeks, and I want to thank you for watching this video. As I listen to the news and read various articles, I often see big numbers like millions, billions, and even trillions. And if you're like me, the numbers are so large that it's sometimes hard to understand their true magnitude. At some point, I tend to stop trying to really understand them and just default to trusting that someone somewhere does understand them and they've got everything under control. What I think we're going to see is that's not the best response. We really should do our best to understand what we are hearing and seeing, period. I'm going to show some numbers today, and we're going to use figures that come from the US government, in part as examples, but also because I want to make a point. Transparently, I don't really like what I see, and I don't think you will either. But hey, we each get to make up our own opinion and on that. So, by the way, this video probably won't make anyone feel good. My apologies. That's not my goal at all. I hope to bring hope to the situation. But we will identify a problem. And the good news is that there is a second video called I Wish Someone Had Shared This With Me. It provides the good news. It provides the answer, in my opinion. So please be sure to watch this video, the first video, to create motivation, to understand the dilemma, but also be sure to watch the second video as well. Again, it's called I Wish Someone Had Shared This With Me. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. As promised, I mentioned we'd be looking at some numbers. So this is $100. I always personally feel pretty good about myself when I have a $100 bill in my pocket. I feel a little bit rich. This doesn't happen all that often. If you stack these things together, you end up with $10,000, and this will fit very nicely, very neatly in your pocket. I would really feel great if I were able to walk around with that in my pocket. Interestingly, you can continue to stack those up, and $1 million will fit pretty neatly on your lap. For such a large number that many of us will work many years to acquire, it is a little bit interesting to realize that it fits in such a small amount of space. It would fit nicely on your lap. Moving on from $1 million, $100 million requires a pallet, but you could pretty easily stash it away in your closet if you really needed to hide it somewhere. It would also fit in the back of your SUV, $100 million. So where do we go from here? $100 million, what's next? 1 billion, yep, 10 of those. Would require probably your bedroom, but most of us could hide $1 billion in our bedroom as long as we were willing to sleep on top. If we're okay with a very firm mattress, $1 billion fits in the bedroom. Now, the next slide, we're going to move from a single stack to a double stack, and we're moving from 1 billion to $1 trillion. You'll see that there's a football field here as well as a soccer stadium, a large airplane, to try to put these into context. And this is the first slide that I want to pause for a second on, and I want to make a couple points. $1 trillion is significant for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons it's significant is because we as a country receive revenue in the form of taxes, and then we spend that revenue. But we have, over the last 15 years or so, spent more than the tax revenue received by roughly, just under, but roughly $1 trillion per year since 2009. Now, we hear these words, these numbers, in the context of deficits and other words that we may or may not fully understand. But deficits is a pretty simple concept. It's just the amount of money that we spend beyond the money that we receive. So if you earn $50,000 a year and you spend $60,000 a year, you overspent by $10,000, your deficit would be $10,000. The government's kind of the same way. But our deficit has historically been, or since 2009, has averaged just under $1 trillion per year. So I got to ask the question, is that a big number? Is that a lot? How big is that, is the title of this entire thing. So how big is $1 trillion? So one way to answer that is to look at the next bullet. I find this personally to be quite intriguing. Let's assume that you were responsible for spending $1 million a day every single day. You'd probably go out and buy houses and boats and cars and jewelry and all sorts of fancy things. But honestly, after a while, how many of those do you really need? It might actually become a little bit difficult to spend $1 million every day for many, many years. If you spent $1 million each day, however, since the moment Jesus was born 2,000 years ago, you still, as of today, would not have spent $1 trillion. In fact, you'd only have spent about 3/4 of that, about $750 billion. So the question is, how big is $1 trillion? If we're overspending our budget by $1 trillion, is that a lot? Is that a little? Well, $1 million a day for 2,000 years is not a trillion. So that would suggest that $1 trillion is kind of a lot. There's another way of looking at it, though. If if the government has a budget of 100 trillion and it overspends by 1 trillion, spends 101 trillion, that 1 trillion over is only 1% over. That doesn't feel like a lot. It's just 1%. So, by contrast, if our budget was 10 trillion and we overspent by 1, that'd be overspending by 10%. Or so, how does that $1 trillion that we're overspending compare to the budget itself? Well, the next slide will speak to that. And this will basically just show you, I'm going to simplify it and just call it money in, money out, because we all can understand that. The money in is the budget, it's the revenue, it's the taxes received, and then the money out is the expenditures. And what you'll see is that over the last 15 or so years, we have spent more than we've received by 32%. So that's equivalent to someone earning $50,000 a year and consistently spending more like $65,000. So earn 50,000, spend 65, take on $15,000 of debt every year for 15 years, or in our case, many years more than that. But nonetheless, you get the point. Here are the specific figures by year. And recently, of course, we've been spending a lot more. COVID has not helped things in that regard. But nonetheless, it is not a new phenomenon that we have been overspending our budget. And this is of concern to some, and we're going to try to figure out if it's a concern to us today. All right. So I am curious also to know, is our spending, I know that we've been averaging about $1 trillion per year since 2009, and you can kind of see that in the blue bars here. We're in the middle at 2021 right now. Main point of this slide, there's a lot here, but just focus on, are the bars on the right bigger or smaller than the bars on the left? And the main takeaway here is simply to see that the planned spending in the future, the planned deficits, I should say, the planned overspending is greater in the future years than it is in the past years. So our plan is to increase our debt at an increasing rate relative to where we've been. So we are not planning as a country on reining in our debt. That's not the plan. The plan is to continue to take on more and more debt over time. That's really the key takeaway from this slide. So let's get back to our pictures. I had a few pictures that we're building, and the next one is kind of an interesting one. Here we have $15 trillion. Now, transparently, this slide, this infographic, I don't create these myself. I found this. This was the amount about 10-ish years ago, when I was doing this about 10 years ago, of our national debt. Now our national debt is no longer $15 trillion. It is $28.7 trillion. And you have to ask, what is the national debt? Well, it's really just the sum of the annual deficits. I mentioned a moment ago that we've been kind of trending for a while at overspending by about $1 trillion a year if you sum all that stuff up. And by the way, we do have deficits and we have surpluses. Surpluses are years where we stay within our budget, in fact, spend less than our budget. The last time we had a surplus was 2001. But nonetheless, if you sum together all the deficits and all the surpluses over time for us as a nation, you find that we are where we are today at 28.7 trillion. Again, this infographic was created a number of years ago, back when it was 15 trillion. Now that stack would be much higher, almost twice as high, to reflect our current national debt. And so that's where we are today. The national debt today of 28.7 trillion is about 125% of our GDP, our gross domestic product. It's 22.8 trillion right now. So we're in the same space of a debt to GDP ratio of greater than 100%. Now, I don't know how old everyone listening to this is going to be, but if you can rewind your memory about 10 years, you remember that Europe had a debt crisis at that point. Certain countries, the PIG countries, the big countries needed bailouts, and really one of the prime definitions of which countries did and did not need bailouts was tied to their debt relative to their GDP. And when their debt was greater than 100% of GDP, they qualified for and were deemed worthy of and needing the bailout money. Now, interestingly, we're way beyond that. as a country. And so it begs the question, how is that the case? Why don't we need this? And the short answer right now, which we don't have a chance to go into in any depth, is that we have an incredible privilege being the reserve currency of the world, at least the primary reserve currency of the world, which basically means other countries have to buy our US dollars. We print the US dollars, they buy the US dollars. There's a huge difference between printing dollars and having to buy someone else's dollars. Unbelievable, I can't emphasize enough, unbelievable privileges that come with that allow us to behave differently than others. The trick, though, is that countries don't remain the reserve currency of the world forever. In fact, if you look back in history, most countries are that for about 75 to 100 years, typically. And we have been the reserve currency of the world for a little bit more than 100 years now. So there's no guarantee that that will continue to be the case. We have to maintain the good faith of the financial community for that to be the case. Nonetheless, sorry, a few details. Let's get back. Let me go on to the next one. But the national debt is at 28.7 trillion. Sum of annual deficits. Key point. $156 trillion. Now, do you see the tower that is $156 trillion? Again, this is an infographic from a number of years ago. Back when I started this, that tower was actually closer to about 100 trillion. It's about 50% larger or taller now. So that tower on the very far right that looks like a skyscraper but isn't, it's dollars, that needs to be another 50% taller than it actually is to represent 156 trillion. Now, why are we even talking about $156 trillion? What is the relevance of that number? And the answer is that $156 trillion represents the amount of our country's unfunded liabilities. Now, unfunded liabilities is a really boring word or set of words. Most of us are not that familiar with it. Many of us have never even heard of it before, and we ask ourselves, what the heck is it? So let's talk about this simplistically for just a second. An unfunded liability is basically an amount of money that is owed, but it isn't available on hand. So the amount of money that the US government owes but does not have on hand. Now, the companies in the US have to follow GAAP accounting procedures, GAAP, GAAP accounting. Interestingly, the US government does not follow GAAP accounting procedures in a few key ways. One of them is this: when you have workers who accrue benefits that will be owed to them, companies generally have to set up financial reserves to pay those liabilities. And the US government attempts to do so, but does not have that same obligation. So they have unfunded liabilities that have accumulated that they owe, but that they do not have resources set aside for. So they don't have the money to pay those bills. It is debt, basically. So if you have, or maybe you are, a civil servant of some sort, maybe you work in the library, maybe you are a teacher, maybe you are a policeman or a firefighter, maybe you just work in the courthouse, in any type of civil servant role, you are one of 24 million people who are employed by the government, 15% of the workforce. Now, you have, if you've been working for any amount of time, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30, who knows, you have basically earned the right to certain benefits when you retire. You are not getting paid those benefits right now. They could come in the form of a pension, retirement assets, it could be medical benefits, a variety of different benefits that have already been earned and that the government owes you, but the government has not yet paid you, and it will pay out over time. That's what the unfunded liability is speaking to, is the value of all those earned but not yet paid benefits that are going to be paid out soon. Now, the emphasis here is the realization that these are very real debts. They are amounts that are owed and will be paid. Now, interestingly, the amount of this normally would have to be listed on the balance sheet. But again, the government doesn't follow this form of GAAP accounting. They don't follow GAAP accounting in this regard. And so this number is not listed. It's considered an off-balance sheet item. And therefore, it doesn't get quantified very often, although there are folks who will dig into the fine print and find it. It's also based on estimates like life expectancy estimates, which change over time. And so this number has a tendency to fluctuate, and because it fluctuates, it's prone to be argued about. And so people tend to avoid this topic. I think the primary reason that it's avoided, however, is that it's extremely unpleasant to begin to think about the amount of money that has already been accrued in terms of the benefits, and the value of those benefits have been accrued, but for which we do not have corresponding assets set aside to pay those amounts. We will have to come up with that money in the future. So this is a true definition of debt. All right, new topic, unfunded liabilities, $156 trillion. That's a lot of money. Let's pivot this and make this personal. What does this mean for you? What does this mean for me? I appreciate the big numbers. I appreciate the tall skyscrapers, but let's translate this into practical implications for us as individuals. So there are 333 million people, American citizens, living in our country right now. That includes men, women, and children of all ages. 333 million. I mentioned earlier that we, on average, for the last since 2009, have averaged just under $1 trillion a year in deficit, overspending. So if we wanted to prevent our debt from getting any larger, not pay down the debt, not pay off the debt, but just prevent it from getting larger, we would need to eliminate next year's deficit or this year's deficit, eliminate the deficit. So what would it mean to eliminate the deficit? Well, if it's $1 trillion and there's 333 million of us, we would each need to pay $3,003 each per person per year to eliminate the deficit. Now, I'm married and I have 2 daughters who live in the house with me. They're young. So we're a family of 4. So for me, that means I would pay all the taxes I pay today already, and I would also pay an additional 4 times this $3,000 amount. So I'd need to come up with, pay all my taxes and pay another $12,000 this year and next year and next year. In fact, we saw that the deficit's going to increase over time. So it's actually, this 3,000 will increase over time, but we'll focus on right now, 12,000 or more per year will do it. Now, personally, it would be extremely difficult for me to pay the taxes I already pay and another $12,000 per year or more on top of that, just to prevent our debt from getting any larger, not to pay down, but just to keep it where it is. But that's our current reality. If we want to eliminate the deficit, we either need to reduce the amount that we spend or we need to pay this amount. Let's move on from the deficit to the national debt. Again, that's just the sum of all of our surpluses and deficits over time. That currently totals 28.7 trillion. So if we wanted to pay off our debts, at least the national debt portion of it, the sum of the deficits, that we'd have to pay off the 28.7 trillion. And at some point, by the way, that does happen in the sense that those bonds, these are all paid for bonds and they have maturity dates. Anyhow, we won't go into that. $86,000 per person. Now, for me, again, head of a family of 4, for me to do my part, I would need to, and by the way, for you to do your part, same thing, this applies to you too, we would each need to pay $86,000 to do our part to pay that off. Or again, as a head of 4, that'd be about $340-some thousand that I would have to come up with. Now, that's kind of impossible for me other than selling my house, selling a lot of assets. I mean, that basically wipes me out. And that's good. That would wipe out most people thoroughly. So have to ask the question, how realistic is it that we can pay for the national debt? How realistic is that? Well, and of course, we owe this amount, and we also owe, in addition to this, the next amount, which is the big number. Remember the unfunded liabilities, these numbers will come due. And you might want to take comfort in the thought that you can pay it off over time, but the trick is these keep rising faster than anything else, and so that really doesn't help. Nonetheless, you can see here the number is quite large. For us to pay off the unfunded liabilities, that's nearly, not quite, but nearly $500,000 per person, nearly $2 million for me. I'm out, totally impossible. I can't even do a fraction of that, especially when it is on top of the $340,000 I'd have to pay to do my part in the national debt. So the point here is to say that if I can't pay these amounts, I begin to ask myself, how many people can pay these amounts? How realistic is it that we can pay the debt that we have accumulated? Now, I love easy answers. I would love to find an easy answer. In fact, what this has prompted me to do is look for the answer to that question. How can we pay this off? What would work? Who else? Rich people, right? Or take things from the stock market or sell national assets. I don't know. What are the options that we could use to pay off this indebtedness So let's take a look at that. I'm hiding a few numbers behind the picture on the right. I'm going to reveal those numbers to you now. Let's take a look at it. Now keep in mind that the value of our debts is basically twofold. There's the national debt, right? The 28.7, and then there's the unfunded liabilities of 156. You add those together and it's a 185. That's what we owe as a nation, ballpark. 185, $185 trillion. Huge number. Okay, so that's what we owe. What could we possibly use to pay them off? Now, the first thing that came to mind for me was the stock market, because the stock market is the market capitalization. It's the market value of basically, generally all the US companies. And there's three versions of the stock market: the Dow Jones, the S&P, the NASDAQ. You can see the values of each of them: 11 trillion, 38 trillion, 33 trillion. If you add them together, 82 trillion. Now, the stock market, however, is owned, the shares of those companies are owned by you and me and your mom and your kids and your neighbors, and even a good portion of it by people who don't live in the United States. It's an international stock market, to be sure. It's not realistic to think that we can just give the companies, which is more or less every major company in the US, to someone to pay off our debt. No one has the authority to give away companies, right? Those companies are owned by people. But even if we theoretically could, which we can't, but if we could, that would generate the value of all those companies is $82 trillion. That would be less than half of what we owe. So the stock market really doesn't answer the question. So the next place I think to look is wealthy people. I know that at least I don't consider myself to be wealthy. There's certainly people who have a lot more money than me. Hopefully they have enough money to solve this problem. So let's take a look. I want to first look at billionaires, because billionaires are wealthy. If we were to, and I want to make this distinction, not tax billionaires more. I'm not talking about taxing rich people more. I'm talking about taking every penny they own, every car, every house, every stock, every company, whatever they own, take every penny from every billionaire, not tax them, just take it. If they've got it, just take every penny away from them and take that money, accumulate it, and use it to pay down our debt. If you did that, if you took the wealth, the cumulative wealth of every billionaire in the US, it totals $5 trillion. Big number, kind of, until you compare it to $185 trillion. It isn't much of it. It doesn't make a dent at all, really. 5 out of 185. All right, so if taking every penny from every billionaire in the country doesn't move the needle, what if we went kind of extreme and we just took every penny from everybody in America? This would mean taking my house, my car, my retirement funds, my savings, my everything, and your parents' everything, your neighbors, everybody's everything, including their stock holdings. You can't add that in because that'll be part of this already. But if you took everything from everybody in the US, our household net worth is about 130 trillion. So that doesn't even get us where we need to be. So now you have to ask yourself, okay, this is not good news. And I kind of foreshadowed that at the beginning. This isn't positive. I don't really like what I'm seeing. The only number bigger than this is to fold in all the assets owned by the government. So the government owns national parks and forests. They own a lot of buildings. They own military bases. They own a lot of military equipment. It's really expensive stuff, probably. If you fold that in, our total national assets, which would be all personal assets like you and me and our houses and our cars and our dollars, and the government's, we're at $177 trillion. Now, I got to ask you, what's the layman's term for the situation where your indebtedness is greater than your assets? Well, I don't even honestly want to say it out loud. It's kind of an unpleasant thought. But this is what I'm really driving us to, is to highlight for us and to try to put some context around some really big numbers and to help us realize that we've got a lot of debt as a nation, and we don't always know that we've got a lot of debt because it's big numbers that we don't always understand. We don't always take time to try to understand them, and that's one of today's purposes, is to try to help us understand these numbers and to put them in context relative to the value of who we are as a nation. So I want to pivot this into one more topic, because ultimately a lot of us are working today and we're working towards retirement. And in retirement, we want to be able to stop working and to enjoy the latter years of our lives comfortably. And I want to highlight one of the implications of our indebtedness, and specifically an implication of the unfunded liabilities. We'll kind of pinpoint that in particular. So I'm going to show you a news article that was published by Forbes just a couple weeks ago. And frankly, there's lots of news articles like this, so it's not groundbreaking. It's actually quite common to see this news article. Lots of people publish this. You can Google it and find all sorts of different versions. It'll say the same thing. But I picked this one because it was short and sweet by Forbes. So this talks about more than an insolvency date, what else to know about Social Security and Medicare trustees reports. Wow, that sounds totally boring. But look at this section for me, with me. The Social Security Old Age Survivors Insurance Trust Fund will not be able to pay full scheduled benefits after the year 2033, 1 year earlier than forecasted in last year's reports. When the trust fund is exhausted, it will only be able to pay 76% of benefits. So let me just summarize this. What it's basically saying is that we are paying in your paychecks, Social Security, money is going to the government that is allocated to Social Security. But the money being allocated to Social Security is not sufficient to pay for Social Security. Social Security will run out of money, is a slang way of saying it, in 2033. That's 12 years from now. When that happens, when it technically runs out of money, it will still be receiving money that come in from our payrolls. So it's not like it goes to zero in that sense, but it will only on a go forward be able to pay 76% of benefits. And I would be the first to forecast that that number will continue to decline over time, or the age at which you can begin to draw these funds out will continue to rise, effectively reducing the benefit to you and I and those who are relying on it. So the key here is to realize that there's already an end to the tunnel, not in a positive way, unfortunately, but in a negative way. We are already seeing that 12 years out, there will begin to be a substantial reduction in the amount of benefits that Social Security will provide those who are receiving it at that time. So that's the first part. The second part of this, it speaks about Medicare. Medicare is the insurance side of the equation. And if you look at this, Medicare will be fully funded through 2026. Well, shoot, that's only 5 years from now. No change from last year's report, and we'll only be able to pay 91% of benefits at that point. So in 5 years from now, Medicare will hit that same kind of point that Social Security hit up above, and will begin to reduce benefits. It'll begin to ratchet down to 91%. And again, I fully expect these numbers will continue to decline over time as we wrestle with our financial situation. The key takeaway from all of this is simply that the retirement benefits that my parents currently enjoy, and that many people, many retirees, well, all retirees today enjoy, will not be the same level of benefits that we enjoy when we retire. We are beginning to see that we are spending more. We don't, those unfunded liabilities are kind of catching up to us because we didn't save the amount of money that we needed. We were giving it away faster than we were bringing it in, and therefore we are going to run dry, and we're going to have to begin reducing benefits. So I have a final slide where I want to kind of summarize this presentation for you. So, summary. Our government, I'm not blaming the government because they are our elected officials doing what we have asked them to do, but our government debt levels have largely reached points that appear to be beyond our ability to pay back. Recall the slides where we talked about what it would take, the $340,000 it would take to pay back the national debt, just me doing my part for my family. Then the $2 million that would be required of me and my family of four to pay my portion of the unfunded liabilities. And think about how many others can actually do the same. Very, very few. Our debt is expected to continue to increase, so we don't by any means have this under control. Instead, it's continuing to grow at an increasingly faster rate. Our government operates today by spending about 30% more than it receives in revenue. And that can only continue as long as creditors, people who buy the bonds that the government sells to generate the revenue, as long as creditors believe that they will be paid back their money in the 10 years, if it's a 10-year bond, or in the 30 years for a 30-year bond, if they do believe they'll be paid back at that time. I believe that there will be a point in time as these numbers become more commonly known and people begin to digest this when creditors or bond buyers basically say, you know, I don't have to buy US government debt. I could buy European debt. I could buy Japanese debt. There, as soon as they decide that there are better options than the US debt and they stop buying or being willing to buy those bonds, then we have to pay a much higher interest rate to get them to buy our bonds. And that, I didn't have time to go into that. That there was a major monkey wrench in this, or they just stop buying altogether. So creditors have to allow us to maintain our current standard of living. And if they choose not to, our current standard of living, at least as it relates to government spending, would drop significantly. Lastly, we talked about retirement benefits are already forecasted to begin to to decrease. And so what retirees today are enjoying is a level of benefits that many of us will not see. And so that leads us to our final point. This is the conclusion of the presentation, simply to say that our financial well-being is increasingly our personal responsibility. uh, we cannot anticipate that Social Security and Medicare will be there for us in the ways that it is present today. It will probably be present in a much smaller or lesser, to a much lesser degree, but not to the extent that we see it today. And therefore, if we want to have a great retirement, it is increasingly upon us to provide for that. We won't be able to ride the government subsidies to us, or entitlements to us as much as our the predecessors have. So that's the main point. And I apologize. I did foreshadow that this is, I don't like what I see. This is the negative news. And I do want to remind you that I do have a second video that I want you to be sure to see. It's called I Wish Someone Had Shared This With Me. And it is the good news. Now, it will not solve this problem. That presentation will not solve our government's problem, because those numbers are too big for any one individual or for any ideas I have to address them. But what it will do is allow you to increasingly take responsibility for your personal financial well-being and put you and your family in a better spot, even if our country continues to struggle. So please check out that video. I'm going to just show you one last thing before I let you go. One last slide. I showed you a lot of numbers today. Sometimes people ask about, Joe, where do you get these numbers? So I just want to show you real quickly. There is a website called usdebtclock.org, and I circled many of the numbers that I referenced today. If you go to this website, every single number on the screen will be spinning around and flying around and changing. It's kind of cool to see. If you ever have interest in this topic, I do just kind of highlight this as a resource for you. But again, it is increasingly our responsibility to provide for ourselves for retirement. The government will not be there for us in the same measure. I'm sorry to break that to you, but it's good to know it. It's better to know it now than to be surprised by it later, because we can prepare ourselves. We can take action. So flip over to the other video. I'll see you over there. Thanks so much.